21st of February 2022.
For me, it's always been about live performance. That's the greatest joy of stand-up comedy. It's intoxicating.
From news.com.au.
I'm Andrew Bucklow, and I've got news for you. I think it's fair to say that Wil Anderson is a triple threat. He's a stand-up comedian who's been performing for more than 25 years. He's a podcast host, with his Wilosophy show being one of the most popular podcasts in the country. And he's a TV presenter who you've no doubt seen on Gruen. And actually, in addition to all of that, he's also just a bloody amazing fella. Today, I'm going to play you part one of my chat with Wil, with part two going live tomorrow. And you're going to hear about the stand-up comedy show that changed his life. He'll talk about his showbiz feud with Andy Lee. And have a listen to this.
There was something that everyone applauded at. And I remember stopping and saying, I think that might be the first joke ever that I have told where every single person in the room spontaneously applauded at the joke. And one guy yelled out, I didn't.
Yeah, you're going to find out what happened when Wil confronted that guy in the crowd. You're going to love that story. Wil Anderson, I was listening to an episode of your Wilosophy podcast from late last year, and you said that you were going to take the entire month of January off.
But I'm going to have a break from it all. I'm going to have a break from all my work and have a little think about what it is that I want to do with my life. Yeah, okay, all right, that's a bit too heavy. I'll explain more, in the future.
So my first question to you, Wil, is what did you come up with?
I mean, I don't know, is the real answer. What I came up with is, could I please have another month? In fact, could I please have another 6 months? I need some more thinking time. I need to phone a friend. I need to ask the audience. That's what I really need to do more than anything, is ask an audience. For me, stand-up comedy, I'd done it 24 years in a row at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival up until the pandemic. It took a global pandemic to stop me doing a yearly show at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. And that yearly show for me is always this idea of, what do I think about my life at the moment, and what do I think about the broader world? And my comedy is always just a combination of those two things. It's a bunch of stories that hopefully have some bigger theme underneath them that is a theme that we're discussing in society, but hopefully my connection to it is through a personal story. So just because the gigs went away for 2.5 years, those conversations did not go away in my head. Yeah. In fact, they were happening more often because I was my only audience. And by the end of the pandemic, I was well and truly sick of my own shit. People say during the pandemic that they binged some TV shows. I binged every decision I've ever made in my entire life. And look, some of them were great. And some of them were terrible. And I sat there and I went, I don't like where this show has gone. I used to like this lead character, and now he's made a really macabre twist. I don't like what he's going through right now. Maybe he'll learn from this. Maybe this is a redemption. And comedy doesn't exist without the audience, right? That's the real thing. Like, a stand-up comedian without an audience is a surfer without an ocean. I always say that the closest analogy I can come up with stand-up is surfing, because you can be the best surfer in the world, but if it's a flat swimming pool, you're still not going to be able to carve it up. In fact, if there's no water there at all, you are now just a guy with a surfboard in an empty ocean, like on the sand. You're a dickhead on sand chucking ollies. That is basically what you are now. It's nowhere near as impressive. If you went down to the beach and Kelly Slater was just down there on a plank of wood, just like hanging 10 off the side, you'd be like, who is that dickhead? Of course, also when you hear what he thinks about vaccinations, you'll often think, who is that dickhead? But I have missed the audience so much, because to me, it's always been about a conversation with the audience. We realised that when we were making the TV shows without the audience, that I've never really been interested in making TV. I've always been interested in making a show for an audience. Yeah. I always feel like on Tuesday night, when we record the shows are done for me. When they go to air on Wednesday night, nothing I can do about it by then. Tuesday night is the night where I have all the power, whether it'll be a good show, a bad show, or anything in between. That is up to me. And it's normally me in front of an audience. So it is me doing a show to an audience. The last couple of years, we have not had that audience. And so it's just been me doing a show to the people at home who are watching the show, which is actually probably the right way to do it. There's only ever, 150, 200 people in the audience. There's like 1 million watching it at home. But for me, it's always been about live performance, that conversation that I can only have with an audience of strangers. That is the thing that I have missed the most. So then it makes you think about when your life has been made up of, if I'm in the open, marriage with stand-up comedy, right, and, it allows me to go and see, television and radio, then if you haven't been seeing a stand-up comedy and you've just been living all the time at television and radio and podcast house, suddenly you're like, hey, what's going on with stand-up comedy? I think stand-up and comedy, I need to go on a few date nights. We need to reconnect with, what's important in our relationship and discover what it is that we loved about each other. And to use that relationship analogy a little bit further, the reason that you fall in love with somebody or something isn't necessarily the reason that you keep loving that person or that thing. So through your life, often your love can change for another person or a group of people or for a job in very different ways. The thing that excited you about it at the start isn't the thing that keeps you doing it from day to day. So having this time off to think, it's been too much. What I really realize is I need a show a year. As ridiculous as that schedule is, a show a year is a good opportunity for me to get all the thoughts that are inside my head outside my head so I can clear some space for some new things that I need to think of. So basically, I just need a big hard rubbish night for everything that is inside. I need to put some shit on the curb, see what people want to pick up, see what needs to go to the tip, and then I can just start buying some new furniture.
Well, excitedly, you've got this opportunity now. We've got the Adelaide Fringe Festival coming up, the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, the Sydney Comedy Festival, the Brisbane Comedy Festival. You've got 2 shows coming out, Logical, which is a pure stand-up show, and What You Talking About, Wil. Now, that's 70 minutes of improvised material. How on earth do you do a show like that?
That's the easy one, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah, because it's fun. Like, it's what I imagined comedy was when I first saw it. When I went and saw Billy Connolly at Hamer Hall with my mum when I was 17 years old, the night that, changed my life forever, sitting in that audience with 3,000 people, 14 to 80, at Hamer Hall, and we're right up the back, Mum had bought these tickets for me, but we've driven down from the country. They were quite expensive for us. It was quite a big deal, and we're sitting right up the back. And I remember sitting in that room that night watching this man come out on stage armed with nothing more than his ideas. No guitar, no big set, no other actors, none of that sort of thing. It was a show unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was just a guy and his thoughts, and he spoke for 3 hours, and he had those people from 14 to 80 all laughing together. And it was that moment that I realized the thing I love the most about stand-up comedy. I didn't realize it in that moment. I've reflected on it, and now I understand what it was that I felt. But what I felt was that's my favorite thing about comedy, that I can have in my audience 1,000 people, and 2 of them, if they ran into each other in the foyer, would not have anything to say to each other and would not feel like they have anything in common in the world. And I get them inside those doors, and in a minute, I can get those strangers to be united in laughing at the same thought. That's the greatest joy of stand-up comedy. Like, it's intoxicating, this idea that you can create that. Like, I mean, essentially monetizing something that people do for free every day, talking shit. That is it. Like, people are willing to give away talking shit for free at all times. But when you see somebody do it at that elevated level like Billy Connolly did, you understand the magic that is in it. And for me, the improvised show, it's magic because it's only for those people in that room that night. The improvised show is what people want to imagine comedy is every time they see it. When they come and see the regular show, and I've hopefully made it good enough that it feels like I'm just saying it off the top of my head. And people might come back a second night and go, oh shit, I thought that bit was just that night, and he does that every night. I feel a little cheated by this. I remember going and see Ben Elton when I was at university, and I loved Ben Elton, and still do, by the way, but I loved Ben Elton's stand-up, particularly at that time. And I went and saw him twice when he was in Canberra, where I was at university. And the first night he did this thing where, because he talks quite quickly like I do, and he spat on the front row of the audience, and then he had this 5-minute kind of apology attack bit about spitting on the front row of the audience. And I remember walking away from that show just going, oh my god, this guy is a genius. He even had a 5-minute routine about the phlegm on the front row. And then I went and saw him 2 nights later, exact same bit at the exact same moment of the show, and I was just like, oh, I've just learned a little lesson about how show business works. But the improv show is different to that. When I first started doing them, people would be like, oh, do you have material up your sleeve? And in a way, I kind of would have. I'd have at least a few stories that I felt like if it got to a blank spot, maybe I could start telling that story. I wouldn't have necessarily written jokes, but I might have like a few tentpole ideas that I could go to. But over the years of doing the show, what I realized was if you have something in your mind, that's the problem. You've got to get everything out of the way. The way that I talk about the improv shows is it's like jumping out of a plane without a parachute, and you've got no choice but to learn how to fly on the way down. That's it. If you have a parachute, at some stage you'll use the parachute, and your brain will constantly be telling you as you free fall, as you panic, pull the cord, right? If there's something there, your brain will naturally go to it. That's why the hardest thing is about the improv shows are if something comes up that you've previously talked about, because it's always very hard to talk about that same thing in a new way. And that's my rule with those shows. If a topic comes up that has come up before, my rule is I can talk about it, but I can't talk about what I talked about last time. I have to find a different angle or a different perspective or some other way to tell that story or, interpret that story. But as soon as you do that, it's much easier to do on fresh topics than it is on something you've talked about before, because your brain has this great thing of going, well, why are you saying that? Like, we already have heaps of great ideas about this. Just say those things. And you're like, sure. Yeah, I need the show to be, I open my mouth and I pursue everything that comes out of it. Now, I talk to the audience and I bounce off people, but sometimes I'm just riffing an idea or something I said, or I've dug myself into the hole, and the joy is to see myself dig myself out of the hole. Like, I mean, one of my favorite bits in any of these shows is, particularly if they've been going good for a while and then I just hit something where it does not work, is like really digging the hole, announcing to everybody that I'm as aware as they are that we are now in a deep hole, and then hopefully letting them watch the majesty of me digging my way back out of that hole.
So, Wil, we've been chatting about your improv show, which is called What You Talking About, Wil. It's playing at the Adelaide Fringe on March 6th. And you mentioned there's a lot of audience interaction. Now, the other day we had Dave Hughes on this podcast, and he told me about a particularly memorable interaction he had with an audience member.
I once talked to a guy in the front row. The gig was going well, but the guy didn't appear to be looking at me. So I said, mate, I'm over here. Stop looking up at the lights. And he matter-of-factly said, I'm cross-eyed. And most people didn't hear what he said, but I lost the plot for about 5 minutes. It was very unprofessional, and the crowd were thinking that I had gone insane, but I just got the giggles. I mean, I didn't want to. I felt bad for the guy. He didn't seem to care. It was just his life. But I do regret asking him that question, and I've never again asked an audience member why they're not looking at me.
So, Wil, have you ever had an interaction with an audience member like that?
I remember... Well, okay, I'll tell you two stories. Firstly, one was I was in Perth, and I can't remember what the joke was. I wish I could remember what the joke was, but there was something that everyone applauded at. And I remember stopping and saying, I think that might be the first joke ever that I have told where every single person in the room spontaneously applauded at the joke. And one guy yelled out, I didn't. And I was like, oh, mate, like, that was such a great moment. There was 2,000 people here, all right? They've all spontaneously applauded at this moment that I've never said before. This is my greatest moment. Why didn't you applaud? And he stands up and he has one arm. So... I mean, I did say to him, you could have, like, slapped your leg or something, mate. Like, you're a very Buddhist approach, one hand clapping. I would have been fine with that. But the other one was, I remember at the Athenaeum in Melbourne, like, I was doing this show and the front row, I tend to work with a pretty dark room, so I can only ever see, like, the first couple of rows. I always say to people in the improv shows, if you don't want to be talked to, if you're not in the first two rows, and as long as you don't shout out, you're not in the show. You're fine. You're safe by row 3. I can't see any further. But this guy was in the front row, and he's like an older guy, and there's like around him is some younger women. Like, I would say probably, somewhere from sort of 16 to 20, these women are, right? Like, down the front row, and then there's older man. And so I kind of spot that at the start. That's a bit unusual. I don't really know what's going on here. And then about 5 minutes into the show, I am convinced that he has fallen asleep. And I am like, and so I was just like, okay, well, I'm not going to say anything about it right now, but I'm going to, like, just keep an eye on this guy. And then, like, 10 minutes later, yeah, he's definitely asleep. And then about 15 minutes later, there is a slight snore, like not a big snore, like not even a snore like everybody else in the room would hear, but because I'm the closest person to him and he's facing me, it's enough of a snore that I hear it. And so I'm like, okay, well, that's it. I have to go with what's going on here. So firstly, I'm like, let's not wake him up first. He's having a snooze. Let's find out what's happening around him. So anyway, it turns out that he was there with his daughters and their friends, and he had worked all day, and then he had driven them from like far away, whatever, to get them to this show, bought them tickets. Like he'd done all the hard work. And now he just needed a fucking nap. And I was like, he didn't really care about the show. He just cared about his daughters and their friends and was trying to do the right dad thing. And normally in that situation, I was like, I am going to crucify this guy when he wakes up. But I was actually like, you know what? That's fine. Let him sleep. If this is what you go to sleep to, mate, it's fine. If you just get a good hour nap, it feels like you need an hour of napping more than you need an hour of laughing. So I am fine with that.
That's an expensive nap. That's what, a $50 nap that he's taking there. But anyway, let's chat about your podcast, Wilosophy. You've done over 200 episodes. You've had so many amazing guests, Jimmy Carr, Amy Shark, Julia Gillard, the delightful Tony Armstrong. Which guest would you say has surprised you the most?
Oh, that's an interesting question that I'm not sure I know the answer to. They all surprise me. Like, I mean, that's the real truth. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think that there's any who haven't surprised me. And that's, I mean, part of that is that I am easily surprised. So my barrier for what I consider to be surprising. Secondly, it's that I don't do any research.
Right.
So I had a soft spot for poor old Matt Doran when he got in trouble for not having listened to the Adele album before the interview, because there seemed to be a very one-sided narrative. Now, by the way, more details came out of this story, and I don't want to like crucify him. It feels like he's been crucified enough and he's had a real hard time with it and he's apologised and all those sort of things. There was part of me that was like, I reckon I could bluff my way through what the new Adele album was about with Adele. You know, it wasn't like she was keeping it all a secret. And her track records, you know, I'd just be like, I'm guessing there's some moody songs about your divorce. I don't know. I don't need to hear it. I imagine I could probably bluff my way through what it might be. But I did feel a little sorry because there were people making great pronouncements about the idea that the only way to do a good interview was to do all the research first and then ask the questions. And I do not believe that is the case. I believe that is a good way to do a certain type of interview. Absolutely, of course, right? And maybe even in Matt's case, that would have been the case. But as a general principle about interviewing, I actually think that that pronouncement is full of shit. Because what I tend to find when people do their research is that they then just ask questions about things they already found in their research. And my attitude is, what's the point of the interview if you're only going to talk about things that are in the research, right? Like, it's that idea of like, oh, you can't interview me if you haven't read my book. Now, I might read your book, or I might get the gist of the book, or maybe it'll be more interesting for me to have a conversation with you about the book without having read the book, because most of the people who are listening to the podcast haven't read the book either. So I might ask the questions that are more interesting to them that might then get them interested to go and read the book. And by the way, you've written a book. So what's the point of us talking about those stories? If people want to hear those stories, they can go and read your book.
Yeah, true.
So I don't try to research the podcast at all. Occasionally, if there is a specific reason that I've got somebody on to talk about something that they have done or an issue that they are interested in, of course, in that case, it is beneficial to the interview for me to have watched the thing. But still, I'm not going to ask them a question that they've already answered on that thing. I'm going to ask them a question about the process of making the thing, or a question that was inspired by something that I saw in the thing. I mean, I hope I'm constantly surprised, you know, by people on the show. And if I'm not constantly surprised, if I'm constantly getting answers that I would have expected to questions, then I've asked the wrong questions.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of the show, is to hopefully not ask. I don't have a plan with the show. I start to talk to somebody and I see what they say, that what they're interested in, and we have a conversation. And I try just to be an active listener in saying, oh, they're interested in talking about this topic, or their eyes light up when they, talk about their family or talk about their work or talk about this particular cause that they're interested in. And therefore, I guess that is, where I get the joy and the surprise, is hearing their natural reactions to things. I mean, the interview that is the most famous interview from the show is the Andy Lee one, of course, which is when he came on the show and we spoke about, the fact that, we had not got along previously, although it was made easier by the fact that we obviously kind of half resolved some of that stuff, and the podcast itself was the fuller, resolving of those things. It wasn't. I think it would be a much more difficult podcast if you had somebody who was an absolute enemy of yours, or you had Andy and I had a very polite relationship with each other up until that point. So I had invited him onto my show. It was a mutually warm discussion, So there were some moments of it being uncomfortable, but it was, done with love from both sides, to kind of deal with something. So that's the one that people seem to have connected to the most. But I would argue that we have those sort of conversations every week. It might not be about someone's relationship with me. It might be someone's relationship that they have with God, or someone's relationship they have with the boss, or someone's relationship that they have with themselves and their own internal monologue. But that is the area where I think the conversation is at its best. What do you think about life? What, how do you interpret life? What do you value? What mistakes have you made? What do you like about yourself? What don't you like about yourself? That's the juice of what that show is meant to be about. And so anytime I get into those areas, you get really good stuff. Everyone surprised me, but there's not an example of me going, oh, I thought this person would be one thing and they were something completely different.
Part 2 of my chat with Wil Anderson is coming up on tomorrow's episode of I've Got News for You, and it is a cracker. He's going to tell us about why he turned down an offer to do a TV version of Wilosophy. He'll reveal which Aussie radio star is banned from his podcast. Ooh. And he's going to talk about the 2 best pieces of advice that he's ever received. Actually, you know what? I'm going to give you one of them now just to whet your appetite.
Don't take criticism from somebody you wouldn't take advice from. Briggs said that to me on Wilosophy one day. Don't take criticism for someone you wouldn't take advice from. That's powerful, right?